Yes, we are live now. So hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to the first Undercurrent News webinar. It's a webinar on the global state of aquaculture. My name is Jan Lepetun. I'm CEO at Undercurrent News, and I'm sure most of you know what Undercurrent News is, but for those of you who don't, at Undercurrent News, we publish, news, analytics, and also special reports and data on the seafood industry. So it's very much our specialty. It is going to be our first webinar, so it's a new territory for us in a way. So we do hope things go smoothly, and apologies if they don't. We would have hoped to see most of you face-to-face at various trade shows and events, but now that most of them have been cancelled or postponed, online meetups like this are a great opportunity to get together. So thank you for joining us. Really great to see so many of you online. At Undercurrent News, we have been documenting the impact that the pandemic has had on the seafood industry and in particular aquaculture. We also have reported from China since the very start of the outbreak of the pandemic. So if you haven't yet, please go to undercurrentnews.com and check out our latest news. So today we are gonna take a look at how and to what extent COVID-19 has disrupted aquaculture, but we'll also look a little bit in the future and see what opportunities it may present. Today's panelists are really well placed to do exactly that. Tom Seaman, whom I believe many of you know, is a co-founder of Undercurrent News and editorial director. So he's had his finger pretty much on the pulse since the very start of the pandemic. Matt Craze, I believe, is also very well known to you. He's been covering aquaculture both in his business consulting work and as a contributor to Undercurrent News. He has recently published his book on aquaculture. Matt joins us all the way from Chile, and Tom and I are in London. Before I give stage to our panelists, a little bit of house rules. We planned that the webinar will go for 45 minutes to 1 hour, and we want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to submit your questions or comments, and you can do it in the chat window where you sign in to see this webinar. I'll be sorting out the questions as they come, and I'll be grouping them together so we can cover as much ground as possible. So now it's over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to share my screen and bring up a presentation. So we're going to do a brief presentation about this aquaculture in a pandemic world. I'm just going to put this in slideshow format. And yes, so if you can see my screen. So just a quick word on why Tom and I decided to do this. We're not industry executives and we're not aquaculture scientists, but what we do on a weekly basis and a daily basis is talk to industry executives around the world. And it gives us quite a broad perspective of what's happening. A little bit more so, in fact, than maybe some industry executives who might be species specific or focused on certain geographies. And I'll get my sales pitch out of the way. We did a 300-page publication on all aspects of aquaculture last year, and we finished this exercise in early 2020. And the intention was to take a look at modern aquaculture, what's going on. I'm not going to read everything on these slides because everybody will get a copy of this presentation. But the really big trends, what we saw was that aquaculture was living through a transformative 2019. Land-based farming is taking off. Atlantic Sapphire is on the verge of opening the first industrial scale facility and really taking it to a new level. The first harvest is planned in this giant facility in Miami for July 2020, and they're very close to doing this. We're seeing very similar developments with offshore aquaculture. And SalMar is actually operating Ocean Farm 1 now in Norway, and we're seeing some new designs coming into operation. So we're in this very interesting phase of this new technology becoming mainstream, but not quite. There's a similar things going on with shrimp. There's indoor shrimp farms being built as we speak. We visited several of these farms as part of the publication. And then there's some new species that are growing very rapidly and could become the next salmon or shrimp or tilapia. So then COVID came and changed our world, right? So everybody knows most of these things. Orders are cancelled. Companies and industries that are focused on food service have been dealt a massive blow with bars and restaurants closed around the world. Supermarkets and online channels have been doing fantastically, and anybody who sells canned tuna has been doing just great. And there's this scramble to switch channels. So governments are helping, but not in all countries. And that's a product of the sovereign finances of each country. So I'll take you through some of these slides. I don't want to spend too long because I want to ensure there's lots of time for Q&A, and I'll pass over to Tom as well. So no surprise, prices are really low. I think for the salmon industry, where I'm sat, it's a big shock because prices have been fantastic since 2016, early 2016. And shrimp farmers have a different challenge because they've had a low price environment for a couple of years. And it means that this is very painful right now. And then we see these really huge drop-offs in GDP in the main markets. I'm going to glaze through some of this stuff. The companies like Cisco and US Foods are very quickly trying to adapt their channels or adapt fresh produce into retail channels. I noticed on Facebook that my cousin living in Auckland just bought salmon from Sanford, a New Zealand producer, and that's an example of these salmon companies quickly assembling B2C strategies to reach consumers as the export markets kind of have been shut down. Fish counters have disappeared. We wonder if they come back. And meal kit companies have been doing great. So the equity market, not much of a surprise that salmon companies are among the worst performers. What you're looking at on the left-hand side is equity performance year to date, so from basically all of 2020. And we've started to see companies suspend dividend payments. Again, SalMar is one of the reasons it said it was suspending a dividend payment was to keep CapEx in place for Ocean Farm 1, this very impressive offshore farm project. So what I've called stage 2 of COVID is this kind of stage which is from now to, who knows, the middle of summer, right? And one of the big things is China's reopening. Restaurants are now open, but there's this question mark if people have changed their consumption habits. Then we've seen in North America, Tyson shutting down meat packing plants. This has been happening in seafood, but also we wonder if it could spur more demand for seafood. So China, I participated in an interesting call with a China trade expert, Paul Lam, and he made this point that potentially Chinese consumers would have got used to home cooking, and trends might be changing on a longer term basis. Online channels have been seeing fantastic growth in consumption, and in China there's a delivery model with these companies like Tencent and Alibaba that can actually bring you fresh produce in 3 hours. So it's a very compelling business model. And actually, we did a poll. Undercurrent did a poll of Chinese executives, and they do see an overall drop in seafood imports in 2020. So at this stage, I think because we're getting into the news section of Undercurrent, I would like to pass over to Tom for a couple of slides and walk through these news items that we've seen recently.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so we've seen some interesting news coming out around land-based RAS projects and also offshore since the pandemic kind of really transferred from China to Europe and the US. There's been a couple of notable examples of projects being either postponed or cancelled, both actually involving Aqua Group, the Norwegian aquaculture equipment supplier, which has got a division supplying RAS equipment. They announced on the Oslo Stock Exchange that the financing for a project in China, which they were supplying the technology for, it was a 8,000 ton salmon RAS project with some Nordic Aqua is the name of the company, so it's some Scandinavian kind of investors and executives behind it. And that they'd been unsuccessful in achieving their goals of financing. I think they were trying to raise $60 million in total, with Skrettin, the big feed company, putting in 20 of that. But they essentially said that because of the situation with the pandemic, they were unable to close the financing, and so they're going to try again to raise capital for the project later in the year. And then at the same time, Aqua also said that Cook, which is based in Canada, but is one of the world's largest seafood companies, which is a major salmon farmer as well, that they'd cancelled an order, considerable order worth $11 million for a RAS hatchery for Chile. And when we asked Cook for some more comment on this, they said that they were essentially looking to conserve cash for their existing operations and not kind of spend money on a development like this. But then there's also been some indications of positive news for the land-based sector. We followed up on the Nordic Aqua project, and Aqua told us that they will look to reinvest. They will reinvest in the project when they look to raise financing later in the year, and that they still envisage their equipment will be supplied to the project. So that showed kind of a commitment from them. We weren't able to get a comment from Skrettin, which was putting in kind of a third of this was putting in $20 million in. They didn't confirm or deny that they would look to reinvest later in the year. So it's definitely one to watch there. And then there was a very interesting acquisition which took place, which was two of the big Japanese seafood groups, Nisui and Marubeni, bought basically 2/3 of Danish Salmon, which is a RAS operation based in Denmark. It's been around for several years. It was actually profitable in 2018. So it's sort of a proven business as opposed to most other kind of RAS projects, which are much more kind of either theoretical kind of raising financing stage, or at the kind of Atlantic Sapphire stage where they've got an operation in Denmark, a small operation in Denmark. They're looking to take a big operation to market in the US. But this deal shows that these two very credible, large seafood players, well, Marubeni is not directly a seafood player, they're kind of a conglomerate, but they've got a big seafood operation. They obviously see a real future in this RAS salmon space. And their statement on the deal was very, very strong, very positive. And when we spoke to Danish Salmon, they said they plan to double their production to 2,500 tons. And also the next step would be using the kind of global connections that Nisui and Marubeni have, and rolling this similar kind of model out in other countries, which is a very interesting development. And then Atlantic Sapphire managed to close a $210 million refinancing with DNB, which again shows these big financial institution really kind of getting behind a project, and the move for Atlantic Sapphire is to do their first harvest in, I think it's July they're aiming for, which is going to be kind of very interesting time for the whole sector, because it's, as Matt said, it's the first like major industrialized large scale project, and it's happening at a time when salmon prices are very low, and that looks like that's going to continue because the COVID situation has kind of essentially wiped out a lot of food service demand, and obviously RAS needs a certain salmon price to to be viable. They've got higher production costs in many ways, although they argue sometimes they would have lower costs than sea farming in other ways. But yeah, it shows that despite all of this, this kind of macro situation, DNB, Nisui, Marubeni, Aqua are all still committed to these projects. And then Grieg, one of the big Norwegian conventional kind of sea farming Norwegian groups, they said in the annual report they were going to cancel certain expansion plans to kind of hoard cash amid the pandemic. But when we asked them for more comment on what they plan to do with a big project in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada, they said that they're pressing on with that. That's something they're prioritizing, and that project involves a RAS hatchery as well as sea farming. So again, it shows commitment to a RAS project in this very kind of tricky macro economic environment. And then offshore was another one of the kind of pillars that Matt covered in this Aquaculture Frontiers report series, and it seems that the offshore projects are still continuing, and we've got examples of a few big Norwegian ones. The Have Farm, which is Nordlaks, one of privately owned, privately held Norwegian salmon farming group. That's on its way from China to Norway as we speak. SalMar, although it's not mentioned here, SalMar is very committed to this huge offshore project, which Matt showed some pictures of earlier. And they're cancelled a dividend to invest in that. We've got another very large one in China. It's called Straits 1. It's a 140 meter pen designed by Damas, a Dutch firm, and that's pressing ahead as well. And then Zhanjiang Gulion, which is China's largest stock-listed company, they recently announced that they're going to invest 2 billion RMB, which is about $280 million in going into offshore aquaculture. And they didn't specify the species or give too much detail about the rationale for it, but I would potentially kind of surmise that these Chinese plays might be linked to, the concerns about the global supply chain for some farmed species, and the fact that they would much rather farm it themselves in their own country and have kind of control over that supply chain, which was actually one of the reasons that the CEO of Danish Salmon, when we interviewed him, going back to the land-based projects, he actually said that he thinks now is the perfect time for RAS, because it's very simple in the supply chain. It's you farm it in the country and you sell it and distribute it to that surrounding country. But then I guess the flip side of that is that obviously the salmon pricing is very low now because of the pandemic, and these land-based farms need higher prices. So you've got almost, on one hand, this situation is perfect. On the other hand, you've got this low price environment, which is far from perfect for anyone farming seafood.
Great, I'll take it again. Going forward, we have this situation where we could see shortages in the supply chain. What's going on in the Tyson case? This has really blown up this week, and it's become mainstream news. I'm sure many of you have seen President Trump speak out and order meatpacking plants to stay open. And it's an interesting conjecture, and we've seen it in seafood. Here in Chile, Blue Mar detected some workers got unwell, and they have to actually just drop the entire production shift. And this same scenario is being played out in the world. I listened to a 30-minute long interview with the Cargill CEO, Dave McLennan, yesterday, and it seems that the industry can cope with this situation, but there could be temporary shortages of certain products. And it would be interesting to see in that case what might happen to seafood demand. So, recovery. The Economist predicts a bathtub recovery, meaning that it's not going to look like a V on a graph, but like a bathtub. And DNB predicts that seafood might see a quicker path to recovery, because obviously, you know, food industry has done it's one of the economies that are doing better because people obviously still consume food. But there's a couple of key things to consider here. Carnegie, that does equity analysis on the Norwegian salmon industry, obviously makes the point that Europe really has to reopen this year in the summer period for salmon prices to recover. And just again, late yesterday, Kamanchaka released Q1 results, and I noticed that Ricardo Garcia, the CEO, said that he doesn't see much of an impact beyond the short term. So that's kind of in line with what the with Cargill said as well. I'm just going to quickly go through some longer term lasting changes. Not that I know them, but just some kind of thoughts that we've listened to from different people. One, what happens to China? I've talked about that a little bit already. Consolidation, and just this issue of if consumers will really change their preferences longer term, and if there's a lasting trend, if people get used to eating at home or using online channels, that type of thing. So The Economist did a really interesting article recently where they said the pandemic will accelerate trends that were already reshaping business. So there were three main topics they picked out: deglobalization, which is, you know, taking apart this globalized world that arose in the 2000s, just more digitalization, and then more consolidation into bigger companies. And I think anybody in the seafood industry can recognize those trends. So deglobalization, we've seen national campaigns to eat more seafood, and also the issue of the US-China trade war, which is actually kind of shaped, I think, in a way, this drop in seafood demand in China in Q1, as well as the COVID-19. That has really become an issue. And there was an interesting thought piece from MIT talking about how any company in the world really has to rethink its supply chain. And just within aquaculture, there has been this really interesting local-to-local boom. Gorgia Nikolic of Rabobank speaks about this, that these industries are actually doing quite well. So in tilapia, we've seen, you know, highly populated countries like Egypt and Brazil build these massive industries that are really as much for the domestic market as for exports. And the same things happen in a way with India and Bangladesh with Pangasius. Digitalization is happening, and blockchain especially could become a really, really disruptive, in a good way, disruptive factor within seafood. You know, seafood is essentially the most complex supply chain in the entire world when you look at any food production system. So this technology has the ability to use sensory equipment at farms, auditors, and all these actors that can upload this indelible information. I was at the GAA conference in India late last year, and I think it was Trevor Lester of Walmart who said that this type of technology is going to be really impactful. And just, you know, right now, we've seen lots of companies when we talk about corporate finances, lots of companies have violated the terms of debt covenants or covenants on loans, and there's a renegotiation process going on. Obviously, banks understand that this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. It's happening across industries, not just the food industry. But obviously, going forward, these disruptions, or this disruption, is going to be incredibly painful. And one private equity investor told us that it's going to be a catalyst for consolidation. We haven't seen that many deals yet. Maybe one early one we saw was Biomar investing in Viethook, which was a company that we visited as part of the Aquaculture Frontiers reports. And we can certainly expect to see more of these deals going forward. And just one final point, I think, is to make that some countries are able to support their companies better than others. There are some companies, I speak frequently to executives in Ecuador, where the government really is very limited in its ability to bail out companies, and so that's an important factor. That concludes our presentation, and I'm going to hand it back to Jan to do a Q&A session. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Tom. Let me switch on my camera back again.
Showing my screen.
Yeah. Thanks. It was really informative. We will now throw it open for the Q&A. We had already a few questions, so please feel free to submit yours if you have any. There is a great wealth of knowledge on this webinar, so it's a good opportunity for you to pick Matt's and Tom's brains. Feel free to do that. That's exactly why we're here. While you are typing your questions, I just wanted to mention that, as Matt noted, he just published a big report. It's like 300 plus pages report on the state of aquaculture. He spent last month, well, more than a year actually, documenting the rapid changes that aquaculture is undergoing. And today we have a special deal for you. It's our thank you for joining this webinar. It's a 20% off on the report purchase. We will send you more information in the email, so look forward to it. Look out for the email after the webinar with the details. Meanwhile, just to throw it open, I'm going to ask Tom. You mentioned that some people do not really expect a flurry of M&A. They don't expect that it would take off after the pandemic is over. What exactly are their arguments, and what do you think about that?
I think it really depends who you speak to as to what they see. There's two sort of different schools of thought, it seems, from people I speak to in the sector with regards to what will happen with M&A. On one hand, you're obviously going to have a lot of companies that are pushed into kind of distressed situations by this, but then which will create, I think, definitely companies. There's going to be companies going under, and we've actually already seen that on the processing and downstream side in the UK. There's been a couple of small companies that have already kind of gone into administration. And I'm not sure whether, take those companies for example, I'm not sure whether they will be acquired. I think probably ultimately what might happen will be the bigger companies just kind of take business from, take that business on. And then you've also got the fact that in this sort of situation, there's going to be less access to capital. Banks are going to be more kind of wary of lending to finance deals, and you've actually got the kind of practical side of M&A, which is doing a due diligence process on assets, having just management presentation. All these things become so much more challenging when you can't do them directly. But then on the other hand, we have still seen deals happening, and speaking yesterday to a couple of one executive in the Greek bass and bream industry and another in the US kind of processing industry, so completely unconnected, and they were both saying the similar thing, and that they were quite bullish on being able to do deals because they both financially strong companies, and they think there will be a lot of opportunities out there. So I guess it really depends on your perspective. And I think a lot of the deals we've seen happening, like the Viethook, Biomar investing in Viethook, or Mitsui and Marubeni investing in Danish salmon, as two examples we've mentioned in this presentation. I imagine both of those deals were kind of, well, the Viet one was definitely underway because we reported last year that they were looking for an investor. So there'd been a process underway. So I imagine the process was very progressed. So it was easy to kind of to finish it off. And I think the same with Danish Salmon. Mitsui was acting as Danish Salmon's distributing partner, basically. So they obviously know the company really, really well. Although Mitsui is a Japanese company, they've got a big operation in Denmark, which Nordic Seafood, which obviously knows Danish salmon very well. So it might well seem kind of a very remote thing that a Japanese company invested in the Danish RAS operation, but the two companies know each other very well anyway, and it's then much easier for an investment to be made. And a good point was made actually by the CEO of Sykes Seafood, which is a UK processing company, which bought a Dutch shrimp processing company called Klaus Paul earlier in the year, and they went through on the deal, even though the client, they could have backed out. They went through, and the CEO of Sykes said that a good business going into the pandemic will be a good business coming out. So I guess you might see kind of deals, based on that. But I certainly think financing the deals will potentially be challenging. But you might find that the groundwork for the deals is laid, and then they kind of get closed, like as things start to return to normal, whatever normal is going to be after this situation, because it isn't totally clear.
So I'm not Jan.
No, I forgot to unmute myself.
There you go.
Yeah, I just had a question to you. I said I know you touched upon it briefly during your presentation, but I just want to ask you more specifically, how do you think the COVID pandemic changed your predictions that you spelled out in your Aquaculture Frontiers?
I think the economists got it right. What we're seeing, and I've heard this from several people, you'll have this acceleration of global trends. So, the global manufacturing industry was finding, China's become a more expensive country to manufacture, and they're starting to go to Southeast Asia. There's, these big trends, and also, companies don't want to be dependent on one country. That type of scenario, that's just going to accelerate. I think that a lot of these new trends, production models that we talked about offshore, that's going to continue to evolve. The land-based farming, as we talked about, has continued to evolve. But one of the key reports we did with Aquaculture Frontiers, because we did this in 6 installments and then we put it together. And one of them we dedicated to aquaculture finance. And I think that for me, one of the most revealing things is when a country has access to, or producers in a country have access to institutional money, then the innovation is completely different. So you see the Nordic countries where the seafood industry is such a big component of those economies, and banks and lenders are willing to back innovations. So, in Norway, DNB is such a big actor in that space and has been such a protagonist. When you go back through the history of the salmon farming industry, it helped to create Mowi. In Denmark, there's a government agency that will actually co-invest in a RAS facility. You don't even have that in the US, where aquaculture is quite an unknown entity. So in countries that are going to be struggling, arguably it might be a bigger ask for companies to obtain that financing. And I think that might be a factor in slowing down the progress of aquaculture. Hopefully that will not happen. And, we do see these investments like Tom and I have just talked about, but the financial aspect of this is really important.
And also the pricing aspect, Matt, as well, because say with the salmon RAS, projects. If the price isn't at a certain level, then the numbers don't make sense. So I guess that will be, if we are going into a kind of a whole new sort of salmon pricing, there's been this talk of, the Oslo analysts have been talking about this super cycle of salmon pricing, this kind of sustained period of, high salmon prices where, 60 NOK is kind of the level it drops to, and then it goes up. But if that kind of time is sort of over, because salmon is so is just so big in food service, isn't it? And same with shrimp. So that I think will be, I guess, the projects that we're covering, they were all underway anyway. It would be impossible to have backed out of these projects, so they have to continue. But it'll be very interesting to see what happens with the kind of the ones that further down the pipeline. If the pricing for seafood stays low because of the pandemic.
Right, and again, the salmon industry has been doing super well since 2016, and most companies, even here in Chile, where companies were really struggling even at the start of 2016, they've made a full recovery. But if you look at the shrimp industry, that industry is really, really weighted down by a really poor price environment for the last 2 years. So anybody who's trying to innovate, is obviously the balance sheets are weak, and it will be a struggle for sure.
We lost Jan.
Yeah. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I muted myself because somebody has sent us a comment that there is an echo. So just in case I press the mute button. There has been a number of questions related to what you just have been discussing. And I guess this one exemplifies it best of all. And it's about what sort of impacts do you believe COVID-19 will cause the aquaculture sector to change their best practices? It's from Phil Fitzpatrick from USA. Matt, I guess it's one for you.
One of the issues with the shrimp industry is when there's lots of producers. This is why it's so different to salmon. There's lots of smaller producers in Southeast Asia. Now, when these companies don't have access to finance, they're living for the next paycheck, and the next paycheck is the next harvest. If you have shrimp in the pond that gets sick, one of the quickest, easiest things you can do is just to get that can of antibiotics and put it in the water, unfortunately. And you do worry about what those types of things in a really low pricing environment when the market is just so strained. I think it is a major concern. And that's, again, one of the reasons, the compelling reasons for aquaculture and food systems, rightly or wrongly, to be produced in bigger, better financed farms, is that companies have got the breathing room to do things right. It's a really interesting debate, and I've spoken to there's some great groups out there like the IDF group who really think through these questions of how smaller companies can adopt the same level of best practices as bigger companies, and that's one of the major challenges I think that aquaculture has to solve.
Great. There are a number of questions on the disrupted supply chain, and one of them is whether you think the pandemic will reconnect consumers with local suppliers of seafood. Matt?
Well, I could take that to start with. I mean, you're definitely seeing that. You're definitely seeing that on. If I take the example of the UK on the wild catch side, the government's even putting forward money to kind of help fishing companies. Basically, kind of, there's lots of e-commerce platforms springing up to bring British fish directly to consumers, which is really great. I guess it's probably less of a factor with the aquaculture sector, because it's the Scottish salmon farming sector is big and it's got, you know, the good logistics. But I guess it comes back to what we were saying about these RAS projects. I definitely think that is a big potential upside for the land-based farming sector. You know, whether it's Kingfish Zealand in Holland or Danish salmon or Atlantic sapphire in Florida, you know, they can really kind of promote around this local, you know, it was already kind of resonating in the US with kind of Trump, you know, Trump's kind of, you know, America first stance. Atlantic sapphire was sort of utilizing that somewhat in their early marketing, you know, this kind of using this kind of American fish for Americans kind of angle. And that's great, and that will definitely help. And they've got the advantage of not having to, you know, flying salmon into the US was previously it had the negative carbon footprint and it had an expense attached to it. But now you've got the fact that it's getting even more expensive because they're having to do it on cargo planes and not passenger planes. But then on the other hand, if the pricing is too low, then, you know, these companies are not going to be able to break even or make money. So it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, because on one hand you'd think it's perfect environment for these kind of for local, but, you know, on the other hand, the price has to be right, because the companies won't be able to continue to exist if the pricing isn't there. But maybe that will adjust and sort itself out in the you know, over time. It's going to be pretty fascinating to see. Matt, have you got any thoughts on that?
No, not much really to add. I just think, you know, obviously in the US imports 90% of its seafood, so there's a continued reliance on imports. Although we've seen, you know, the US is trying to push this Aquaculture Act, and that's starting to slowly evolve. China, this call I was on 2 days ago with Paul Lam, really good. And, you know, he was saying that, you know, China now is becoming, because there's just so many, you know, if tier 2 cities take your middle class consumers up to about 400 million, there's an acceptance in China that they're just going to have to continue to import much more food. And they're working, you know, countries that are friendly to China are preferred. So this call was directed towards Ecuador. So I think those big trends as well are important to consider. Just wanted to quickly say, I realized on the previous point that I said IDF and I meant IDH, so apologies to Flavio Corsino, I've spoken to on different occasions. That, again, they work with this issue of thinking through finance for smaller farmers. So I just quickly say that.
And the issue with China and local food will be interesting, because previously there's been this stigma attached to local food in China with the various kind of scandals they've had with locally produced food, and it's created this kind of desire for, you know, the middle class to have foreign produced food. So it's going to be really and these kind of land-based and offshore projects we're seeing emerging in China are much more about the domestic market. So these big Chinese companies obviously think there was going to be something of a shift towards, you know, more celebrating more locally produced food, because that is almost the opposite attitude to we have in Europe and in the US, where people, you know, think they want kind of locally produced food, but they're not willing to pay for it most of the time. Whereas in China, there's sort of almost an honesty about it. They want imported food because they think it's got a cachet to it. But it'll be very kind of interesting to see if that changes. And obviously the guys doing these big offshore and land-based projects in China clearly think that it will.
Right. And I keep going back to this call I listened to 2 days ago. It was just so interesting. And one of the points that Paul Lam makes is that not only do you have this sizable middle class, but you have a lot of people have disposable income in China, because a lot of families live together until they're quite old, and they stay in the family home until they're married. And then even then they receive this kind of support from older generations. And people just spend a lot of money on food, and they like to eat well. So, you know, if you eat a shrimp, you know, if you go to a local restaurant, you'll just get shrimp. But people, if you're eating well, if it's a an important meal. They like to see a really nice full red shrimp. So he was talking about the potential for Ecuadorian and Argentine exporters that specialize with these head-on products that could really do well in this market. And I think there's so many misconceptions about the Chinese market, and it's always fascinating when we go every year and we're always marveled at how this country just keeps developing every year.
Matt, Tom, we had like a good dozen of questions about these species, so I think I'll just group them together and ask what sort of impact do you think the COVID-19 will have on species, whether we should expect any exotic species to come to the market, and given that the prices have been so low recently, well, for a good year for shrimp in particular, how does that justify investment? So I think these are two big groups of questions we are getting right now.
I'd be happy to take that one, actually. We spent, on the last part of the Aqua Frontiers report, we spent a lot of time looking at barramundi. I visited Australis, barramundi in Vietnam. And more recently, there's been this really interesting development that Louis Dreyfus, that's been slowly, one of these huge feed companies like Cargill, that's been slowly developing a strategy to get into aquaculture. And it bought into a Chinese feed producer, I think it was in 2018, maybe last year. But then now they've taken a stake in a barramundi company in Singapore. But not only that, they've partnered with Temasek, which has this aquaculture innovation center in Singapore, and they're trying to develop this as a species. And that is a new species that has real traction, and I think that's going to continue. Of all of there's a group of tropical marine species that are growing very fast. So you have cobia, and you have the grouper species, and there's one or two others that are showing really high growth rates. Tom, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that one.
I think it seems, certainly at the minute anyway, that in terms of the performance of different species in this climate, whether it's at wild or farm, this seems to be very price driven. The people that are doing really well, when I say really well, it's comparatively well, are products in retail that are of good value, I think. So you're seeing tilapia sell well. You see it in the US. You're seeing Alaska pollock sell well in the US and in Europe. It's very value driven, and it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out when things kind of settle down somewhat, because that's obviously been driven by this kind of almost like psychosis and panic that people have been going through with regards to panic shopping, filling up the freezer. But I guess you can already see that. I'm sure everyone is noticing that in retailers, that the shelves in there are better stocked. You can see that the panic is kind of abating somewhat. So and I've heard chatting to salmon farming executive earlier today, and he was saying that you're seeing in the US that the salmon pricing is coming down and tilapia pricing is going up, and almost converging, just because people are gravitating towards those more kind of commodity bulk staple products. But that obviously that's not going to continue. I suppose it might be that the producers of salmon and shrimp have to adjust their product mix and focus much more on retail, much more frozen products, I guess. But then as these lockdowns sort of relax, then maybe things will change. It's hard to say. What was the second part of the question, Jan?
I think I missed it already. I moved on. You caught me off guard here, really. Anyway, we can move on. I think the question was how the low prices can justify innovation in aquaculture.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, it'll have to be some brave financial backers out there. And you mentioned Matt. You mentioned the Barramundi project with Temasek and Louis Dreyfus getting involved, and like maybe you'll see more of that. I guess you'll see that's the thing, is there is a lot of money out there. You know, you've had so many big private equities have raised huge amounts of money. They've got funds to invest, and there might be some opportunities there where you see more strategic investment in the sector from the financial sector, which we've started to see anyway before this. But you might find that that's the way this gets financed, because the pricing environment is going to obviously, like, again, this salmon farming executive was saying that if the companies are averaging things out and they're going, well, we're looking at 50 NOK as our average price now instead of 60, then it's a whole, the numbers don't add up then to be pouring money into innovation and new investments, and but yeah, it'll be an interesting one to follow. Maybe we'll see more of money from outside the sector coming in to finance some projects.
Yeah, there may be a little bit of just this concept of buy low, sell high. So people will look at food systems as an asset class, and they'll want to invest in stocks, and what shall I buy in? The food industry might seem quite a compelling story versus others, I guess.
Mm-hmm. We have like 5 minutes left before we conclude, but yeah, let's try to squeeze in a couple of questions more. We had a number of questions about the impact the virus will have on various countries, and in particular, a few of our viewers from the US are asking us if it's an opportunity for the US producers to promote better the grown in the US trend, and how, in particular, how they can promote organically grown US produce.
Matt, do you want to go? Do you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I can start it off. There's definitely interest in these local systems, but if you look at some of the major projects in the US, you're talking about Scandinavian and European investment money. Atlantic Sapphire is, and so is Nordic Aqua Farms. And then there's one or two groups on the fringes like Whole Oceans, which actually is permitted for a land-based salmon farm in Maine, and one or two other smaller groups that are out there doing things, but it's still quite early stage. And the offshore, developing offshore seems to be really challenging because there are so many local laws, federal laws, environmental protection laws through the EPA. I think there's a lot of goodwill to try and have that develop, and a lot of potential, but it seems to be still a lot of hoops to jump through for these companies.
Yeah, and there has to be the pricing has to be in place to justify it as well. But I think, yeah, the US is definitely it's almost the perfect country for these RAS projects, because you have, this very fragmented retail sector where, you might have, there's only, I think, a couple, there's maybe only Walmart and Kroger. Someone probably correct me on that, but there's certainly not too many national retailers. So you have, like, say, Publix is the dominant player in Florida. You've got Wegmans, big in sort of New York State. You've got these very regionalized retail, which that then you can have a producer in that region that then kind of ties in with relatively small volumes, 5,000 tons or 10,000 tons. I suppose that would be a bit large actually, but you can then tie in with that retail chain or section of retail chains in the state and really promote the provenance story. And yeah, it's a great, and then maybe that provenance story and that, with that, you can then try and get people to pay the kind of the price that will need to be paid to justify the higher cost of land-based production, even though obviously with land-based production, you're cutting out a lot of the logistical costs. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely a great story there with these projects, and that's why that's why they're getting the money they're getting, and everyone is just going to be watching this Atlantic Sapphire project. That's that will, I think, if that goes well, then it could open the floodgates for more, because there's definitely several other big US RAS projects that are in the works, but that are, from what I understand, the financing for them has effectively been put on hold until this situation clears. So if Atlantic Sapphire managed to kind of get this done, then that could well change that in investors' minds, and they could press ahead even if the COVID situation is still lingering. Because I mean, it sounds like people are even. One source of mine was even speculating that maybe Boston next year won't be on. It could. This is going to hang around for quite a long time, I think. But business is adapting. Is already adapting. So things will continue.
Yeah, and I think as well, just to finish that point off, in the US, there's a lack of familiarity with aquaculture in the finance world. So very few banks are equipped to understand these projects. So I remember speaking to folks at the University of Maine, and there's lots of grants for people to set up small scale facilities. There's fantastic facilities. You'll get a space in the lab at the University of Maine. But when you take that step up to go industrial scale, there's a void of options, finance options to take it to that next level.
Yeah, that's why I guess you're seeing DNB, a Norwegian bank, financing this massive project in the US. You've got the banks that have got the expertise in the space stepping in, even if they're not US.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, Matt, Tom, I believe that's all we had time for now. We have not managed to answer all the questions, but I guess we've dealt with a fair number of them. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And it's been a great experience for us. It's our first webinar, as I said, so I hope you liked it too. This presentation will be available to you, and you can access it at the same page where you logged in to this webinar. Otherwise, we'll send you an email, so look out for our email with the presentation in it. Meanwhile, visit undercurrentnews.com for your news, data, and special reports. We hope to see most of you again soon, face-to-face or online. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.